Ever look at like a wedding photo and just kind of wonder about the story? Like what brought these two people together?
Yeah.
Well, today we're going down a rabbit hole that's both personal and societal, I think, and that is interracial marriage in America.
Oh, very cool.
So we're doing a deep dive into data from the American Community Survey.
Okay.
And specifically, we're looking at newlyweds between 2008 and 2016. So
All right.
that's the data set.
Gotcha. So like right in the heart of like the kind of the big demographic shift that's been going on.
Yeah.
Very cool. I'm excited.
Ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
What's so interesting about this data, I think, is that it's not just numbers. It's really like this reflection of America in transition.
For sure.
We're talking about a period of increasing diversity. And this data really lets us see how that played out in, one of the most fundamental social institutions, which is marriage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Marriage and family are like the bedrock of pretty much every society.
Right.
And this is a period where a lot of things are changing. So it's really interesting to see how those changes are reflected in who's choosing to partner with who.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds here, what is the big picture takeaway? I mean, did America's marriages become as diverse as its population during this time?
Well, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
I'd say that the short answer is yes, but there are some really fascinating twists and turns along the way.
Okay.
We do see a clear trend towards more interracial marriages.
Okay.
But it's not uniform across all groups.
Okay.
And that's where it gets really interesting because it challenges any sort of simple assumptions we might have about how different communities are integrating.
Okay, so let's break it down.
Yeah.
The data focuses on white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans. So where should we start?
Let's start with white Americans.
Okay.
This group shows a very high rate of in-group marriage.
Okay.
Around 90% for both men and women.
Okay.
Now, part of that is simply because they make up the majority of the population, right?
Right. Yeah, just more potential partners.
More potentially partners within the same group.
Yeah. But it's not just about the numbers, right?
No, it's not.
I mean, a 90% in-group marriage rate suggests a pretty strong preference, even in, a diversifying society.
Exactly.
To marry within the group.
Yeah, there's something else going on there.
Yeah.
And what's really intriguing is that this pattern remains relatively stable over time.
Okay.
It tells us that even as America becomes more diverse, there are these deeper social forces at play.
Interesting.
That contribute to these in-group preferences.
Okay, so we've got kind of baseline here with white Americans. Now let's jump to, I think, like the deep end here, Asian Americans.
All right, let's do it.
I've heard there are some really surprising trends here, especially when we look at gender differences.
Absolutely, yeah. This is where the data really starts to challenge our expectations.
Okay.
So, for example, Vietnamese women are 3.6 times more likely to marry outside their group than Vietnamese men.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty striking difference. And we see a similar trend, though less pronounced within the Hmong community as well.
So you're saying it's not just a Southeast Asian phenomenon?
Right. It's not isolated.
Okay.
If we look at East Asian groups like Japanese, Korean, and Chinese communities, we see a consistent pattern.
Okay.
Women in each of these groups are significantly more likely to marry outside their group than their male counterparts.
So we're seeing this trend across multiple Asian American communities.
Yeah, across the board.
So what could be driving such a dramatic gender divide?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, is it purely cultural?
I think culture plays a role, for sure. But we can't ignore the historical context and social forces that shape these patterns.
Okay.
We're talking about a period when America was grappling with its own legacy of racial inequality.
Right.
And these inequalities manifest in really complex ways, including in the realm of romance and marriage.
So it's not just about individual preferences. It's about navigating a social landscape that's shaped by history, by stereotypes, by power dynamics, all of that.
Absolutely. All of those things are intertwined, and they can create very different realities for men and women within the same ethnic group.
So we need to kind of delve deeper into, like, the specific challenges and opportunities that Asian American men and women face in the dating world.
We do. It's a fascinating area to explore.
Okay, now before we do that, you mentioned South Asians as kind of the exception to this trend.
Yeah, that's right. Indian and Pakistani communities actually show high rates of in-group marriage for both men and women.
Okay.
More aligned with what we saw with white Americans, actually.
So what do you think that is? I mean, just given that, South Asian cultures have such a strong emphasis on family and tradition.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
Cultural and religious influences are powerful forces.
Yeah.
Particularly in communities where arranged marriages are common.
Right.
And family ties are very deeply valued.
Right.
Marriage in these contexts is often seen as more than just a union of two individuals.
Yeah.
It's about connecting families
Right.
and preserving cultural heritage.
It seems like we're already starting to see a complex interplay of factors here. Demographics, history, culture, social perceptions,
Absolutely.
all shaping these different marriage patterns.
It's a multifaceted issue, for sure.
I'm eager to unpack it all.
Yeah, me too.
This is fascinating.
Let's dig in. Yeah, it really is a complex picture, isn't it?
It is. And you mentioned that we need to dig deeper into these experiences of Asian American men and women.
Right.
And specifically, you said, we can't shy away from some of these uncomfortable topics like stereotypes
Yeah,
and how those might be influencing these marriage patterns.
absolutely. I think we have to address the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Asian women, especially those from Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
have been subjected to, this kind of hypersexualization and fetishization for decades.
Right.
And this perception is often fueled by, Mia portrayals and a long history of harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
And this can lead to a higher incidence of interracial marriage, particularly with white men.
It's almost as if these women are seen through this distorted lens that reduces them to these exotic objects of desire.
Yeah.
Rather than, complex individuals with their own agency.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's a sobering reminder that even in a society that's striving for equality, these deeply ingrained biases
Yeah.
can really shape people's romantic prospects and even their life choices.
It makes you wonder, are these women choosing to marry outside their group because they genuinely prefer those partners? Or are they being pushed towards those choices by a society that views them in a particular way?
That's a tough question to answer definitively.
Yeah.
And it likely varies from person to person, right?
Right.
But it's crucial to acknowledge that these external pressures exist.
Yeah.
And they can influence decisions even on a subconscious level.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, we have Asian men who often face a completely different set of stereotypes.
Totally.
Right? They're often portrayed as less masculine or less assertive, less desirable partners.
Yeah, especially compared to white men, right?
Right, exactly.
There's this kind of implicit hierarchy there.
And these stereotypes, while they're deeply unfair and inaccurate,
Totally.
can create real obstacles in the dating world.
They do. It's like there's this invisible script that society has imposed on them
Right.
that limits their perceived attractiveness and desirability.
So we're seeing how these stereotypes, these harmful narrative, can shape the dating landscape for Asian Americans in very different ways for men and women.
Absolutely.
It makes you realize how deeply intertwined our personal lives are with these larger social forces.
Yeah, and it brings us to another important point, I think, which is the role of social mobility
Okay.
and how that might factored into interracial marriage decisions.
So tell me more about that.
Well, some individuals, particularly from minority groups, might see intermarriage, especially with white partners, as a pathway to upward mobility.
Okay.
They might believe it offers access to resources, opportunities, a more privileged social sphere.
So it's not just about love and attraction.
Right.
It's about navigating a complex social hierarchy where certain groups have historically been marginalized or denied access.
Exactly. It's about trying to overcome those systemic barriers to gain a foothold in a world that hasn't always been welcoming.
Right.
Now, it's important to emphasize that not every interracial marriage is driven by these considerations.
Right, of course.
But it's a factor we can't ignore.
It's a reminder that even the most personal decisions, like choosing a life partner, can be influenced by these larger social and economic forces.
Absolutely. It speaks to the importance of understanding these patterns, not just as abstract data points,
Yeah,
but as reflections of lived experiences, individual choices,
right.
and the complex realities of navigating race identity and opportunity in America.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Asian Americans. Let's shift gears and look at Black Americans.
Right.
You mentioned earlier that Black women have the highest in-group marriage rate across all groups.
That's right. 89.2%, a powerful statistic.
Yeah.
That speaks to the deep historical and sociocultural bonds within the Black community.
So what are some of the historical factors that have contributed to this strong in-group preference?
Well, we have to consider the legacy of slavery and segregation,
Right.
which for centuries forced separation and limited social interaction between Black and white Americans.
Yeah.
These experiences created a really strong sense of shared identity and solidarity within the Black community,
Yeah.
which continues to influence social patterns, including marriage choices.
It's almost like a defense mechanism, a way of protecting and preserving a community that has faced so much adversity.
That's a very insightful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about history, it's about ongoing social dynamics as well. Black Americans, particularly Black women, continue to face discrimination and bias in various aspects of life, including dating and relationships.
So those experiences, both historical and contemporary, create a context where in-group marriage might feel like a safer, more comfortable choice.
Absolutely. It's about finding connection and belonging within a community that shares your experiences, understands your struggles,
Right.
and celebrates your identity in a way that the outside world might not.
And what about Black men? Is there a similar trend toward in-group marriage?
Well, the data is a bit more nuanced for Black men,
Okay.
but it's clear they also predominantly marry within their group or other minority groups.
So it seems like there are multiple factors at play here. Shared history, social pressures, and even ongoing experiences with racism and discrimination, all contributing to these high in-group marriage rates within the Black community.
Precisely, and it underscores the importance of considering each group's unique historical and social context
Yeah.
when we're analyzing these marriage patterns.
We can't just look at the numbers. We have to understand the stories behind those numbers.
Exactly.
Well said. Okay, we've covered white Americans, Asian Americans, and Black Americans.
We have.
Let's move on to Hispanic American.
Okay.
What does the data tell us about their interracial marriage trends?
Hispanic Americans present a more balanced picture compared to the other groups we've discussed.
Okay.
They have relatively high rates of intermarriage, with men and women showing similar patterns.
So we're not seeing that same stark gender divide that we saw with Asian Americans.
Right, and I think several factors contribute to this.
Okay.
Firstly, the Hispanic population in the U.S. is large and geographically concentrated,
Okay.
which naturally increases the likelihood of in-group marriages.
Right.
But there's also a significant degree of cultural blending,
Yeah.
particularly with white populations.
You're referring to like the shared language and the cultural commonalities in certain regions?
Exactly. And historically, there's been more fluidity between Hispanic and white communities,
Okay.
which likely contributes to the higher rates of intermarriage.
Okay, so we've looked at the distinct marriage patterns of 4 major racial and ethnic groups in America.
We have.
And it's clear that demographics, history, culture, and social perceptions all play a role.
They all factor in.
But I'm still left wondering, what does it all mean? Like, what are the broader implications of these trends?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll continue to grapple with as America becomes even more diverse. But what I find fascinating is that these marriage patterns offer a window into the evolving dynamics of race identity and belonging in our society.
It's like we're seeing a snapshot of America kind of, figuring itself out in real time.
Yeah.
And marriage is just, one of the most personal and profound ways those changes are playing out.
I agree with that. And as you've been, exploring in the sources you've shared, the snapshot is just the beginning.
Right.
As America continues to diversify, how do you think these marriage patterns will evolve in the future?
Well, I imagine it's a bit like predicting the weather,
Yeah.
We can see some general patterns.
Yeah.
But there are so many variables at play that it's impossible to say, for sure. But what are some of the factors that you think might influence these future trends?
Well, one of the biggest wild cards, I think, is technology.
Okay.
Think about the rise of online dating and social media.
Right.
These platforms are changing the way we meet and connect with potential partners.
Yeah.
And that could have a really significant impact on interracial relationships.
That makes sense, because if you're no longer limited by your immediate social circle or your geographic location, you're exposed to a much wider pool of potential partners.
Exactly.
And that could lead to more interracial relationships.
Yeah, and it's not just about quantity, it's about shifting social norms as well.
Okay.
Online platforms can create these spaces where people from different backgrounds can connect and interact in ways that might not have been possible before.
Yeah.
It can help break down some of those barriers that have traditionally led to these in-group preferences.
So technology could be like a catalyst for even greater diversity in marriage patterns?
Potentially, yeah, but we also have to consider the influence of globalization and migration patterns as well.
Right.
America will continue to welcome people from all over the world.
Right.
And that will inevitably shape the racial and ethnic makeup of the country and, by extension, its marriage patterns.
It's like this giant social experiment unfolding in real time, and we're all participants in it, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, we're all part of this grand experiment.
It makes you wonder what the next, few decades will bring.
It really does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into interracial marriage in America, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will kind of ponder?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they appreciate the complexity of this issue.
Yeah.
There's no single explanation for why people choose to marry inside or outside their group.
Right.
It's a tapestry of influences, personal preferences, cultural norms, historical context, social perceptions, economic factors, they all play a role.
And we've seen how those factors can create very different realities for different groups.
Yeah.
What might seem like a personal choice is often shaped by forces larger than ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these forces, to understand how they operate and to challenge them when they perpetuate inequality or limit opportunity.
So it's not just about understanding the data, it's about using that understanding to create a more just and equitable society where everyone has the freedom to love and marry whomever they choose.
Beautifully said. And I think that brings us back to your original question about, the story behind the wedding photo.
Yeah.
Every couple has a unique journey,
Right.
a narrative that's shaped by their individual experiences and the social context in which they live.
Yeah.
And those stories, when woven together, they create this really rich and complex tapestry of American life.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in a society as vast and diverse as ours, we're all connected in ways that we might not always realize. Our choices, our relationships, our stories,
Yeah.
they all contribute to this larger narrative of who we are as a nation.
They do. And as that narrative continues to evolve,
Yeah.
I hope we'll embrace the diversity and complexity of human relationships and strive to create a world where love and connection can transcend, these artificial boundaries.
Well said to our listeners. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.
Right.
The worlds of interracial marriage is really just one window into these larger dynamics of race identity and belonging in America.
Yeah, it is.
And as you continue to kind of delve into these topics, we hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and some food for thought.
I hope so.